June 3, 1944, 400 hours. In a cramped meteorological station aboard the USS Ancon, anchored off the southern coast of England, Lieutenant Commander Irving Crick stared at the barometric pressure readings that would determine the fate of 156,000 men. The North Atlantic was brewing one of its notorious spring storms, and every weather chart screamed the same message: postpone Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day. But Crick's hand hovered over a different forecast, one that contradicted every traditional meteorological principle he'd been taught at Caltech. What the Allied High Command didn't know was that Crick and his team of U.S. Navy weather officers had spent the previous 8 months developing a revolutionary and highly controversial forecasting technique that their British counterparts considered dangerously unreliable. They called it lying to the weather. And in 72 hours, this unorthodox approach would help win the most crucial naval battle of World War II. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how American meteorologists weaponized deception, challenged centuries of weather wisdom, and turned atmospheric uncertainty into strategic advantage during the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The air in the Ancon's meteorology room was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of damp wool. Maps covered every available surface, their isobar lines a chaotic tangle, indicating a vast, churning low-pressure system marching inexorably towards the English Channel. Crick, a former professor of meteorology, adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the latest teletype printouts from distant weather stations, a few precious outposts in Iceland, Greenland, and the limited Atlantic convoys. These sparse data points were all they had to piece together the immense atmospheric puzzle over an ocean dominated by enemy U-boats and radio silence. The stakes were unimaginable. D-Day, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, hinged on a narrow window of opportunity dictated by tides, moonlight, and, most critically, the weather. The plan called for an invasion on June 5th, requiring specific conditions: low winds for the landing craft, moderate seas to avoid swamping, high cloud ceilings for air support, and a partial moon for paratrooper drops. Across the Channel, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Bushy Park, London, Group Captain James Stagg, chief meteorologist for the invasion and head of the British weather team, was wrestling with similar data, arriving at a grim conclusion. Stagg, a meticulous and conservative forecaster, adhered strictly to the synoptic method, which relied on real-time observations and the extrapolation of current atmospheric physics. His team's projections indicated gale-force winds and dangerously high waves continuing well into the planned invasion days. Postponement seemed inevitable. Stagg's colleagues at the Met Office shared his deep-seated skepticism regarding the American analog technique, a method Crick and his team championed, which involved comparing current weather patterns to historical ones to predict future conditions. The British view was that each weather system was unique, and relying on past events was akin to fortune-telling. But Crick and his American counterparts, including Captain Sverre Pettersen, a renowned Norwegian meteorologist, believed the historical patterns held predictive power. They had painstakingly catalogued decades of North Atlantic weather data, seeking recurring atmospheric fingerprints. For the past year, their forecasts had often diverged from the traditional British predictions, sometimes with startling accuracy, sometimes with perplexing misses. The tension between the two schools of thought was palpable, fueled by national pride and the immense pressure of their shared mission. For the invasion, any significant deviation in wind speeds, even a few knots, could mean the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophic loss of life and equipment. Waves above 4 feet were deemed unmanageable for the thousands of small landing craft essential to the operation. A cloud ceiling below 200 feet would blind the crucial air cover. As Crick looked at the charts that morning, showing barometric pressure plummeting across the North Atlantic, signaling a potent and persistent storm, the traditional methods offered no hope. Yet, his own unique, almost heretical, method whispered of a different possibility, a brief respite buried within the larger storm. a chance to lie to the weather, or perhaps simply to see a truth no one else could. The opening of this narrative has set the stage for a dramatic conflict between scientific methods and personal conviction, where the lives of hundreds of thousands rested on a single, controversial weather forecast. The impending decision would forever alter the course of World War II, a decision profoundly influenced by a technique born out of desperation and intellectual daring. This is where the true story of lying to the weather begins to unfold, revealing the ingenuity and courage required to challenge established norms in the face of overwhelming odds. The decision was not merely about predicting the weather, it was about interpreting it, about finding a window of opportunity where none seemed to exist. The British meteorologists, with their conservative physics-based approach, saw a wall of unyielding storms. Stagg, a man whose reputation was built on precise, if sometimes overly cautious, forecasts, felt the immense weight of responsibility. His synoptic charts were clear. The relentless low-pressure system would bring sustained winds of 25 to 30 knots, whipping the channel into a maelstrom of 6-foot waves, far exceeding the operational limits for the landing craft. To advocate for anything less would be a dereliction of duty, a gamble with human lives. Yet Crick's team, employing their experimental analog technique, saw something different. They passed through their vast database of historical weather patterns, comparing the current atmospheric setup to similar ones from decades past. Their analysis, still nascent and unproven on such a scale, suggested a temporary, almost miraculous lull in the storm. It was a statistical anomaly, a fleeting gap in the meteorological fury, an escape route that conventional wisdom refused to acknowledge. The conflict was not just between two forecasting models, but between two fundamental ways of understanding the natural world, each demanding absolute faith from its proponents. The tension permeated the highest echelons of Allied command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, understood that weather was his most formidable adversary after the Germans. He had assembled a triumvirate of meteorological teams, Stagg's British Met Office, a Royal Navy team, and Crick's U.S. Army Air Forces group, to provide him with the most comprehensive possible picture. But instead of convergence, he was getting divergence, a stark contrast in predictions that forced him into an unenviable position. The weather maps, overlaid with wind speed vectors and isobaric contours, became battlefields in themselves, each line and number contested, debated, and re-evaluated. Crick, a Californian with a penchant for bold predictions, stood ready to argue his case, even if it meant challenging the established scientific consensus. He believed in the power of pattern, the hidden order within chaos, and he was convinced that the North Atlantic, for all its ferocity, harbored secrets that only his unique methodology could unlock. The fate of the invasion, and perhaps the war, hung precariously on which of these conflicting interpretations Eisenhower would ultimately trust. The revolutionary technique Crick's team was now championing had its origins not in the immediate lead-up to D-Day, but in the desperate lessons learned from earlier, disastrous operations. Flashback to August 1943. The nascent American Weather Forecasting Unit, still finding its footing in the complex European theater, began to question the limitations of traditional synoptic meteorology. Lieutenant Commander Crick, though officially part of the U.S. Army Air Forces, worked closely with naval meteorologists, driven by an almost obsessive desire to improve the accuracy of long-range forecasts. He believed that the highly dynamic weather of the North Atlantic, with its rapid shifts and unpredictable storms, demanded a new approach beyond simply projecting current trends. The existing methods, while scientifically sound, often struggled with the rapid intensification and dissipation of complex weather systems, particularly when data from across the German-controlled Atlantic was non-existent. Crick, a brilliant but sometimes abrasive academic, had gathered an eclectic team. Among them was Captain Sverre Pettersen, a distinguished Norwegian meteorologist who had fled his occupied homeland. Pettersen, a master of physical meteorology, initially viewed Crick's burgeoning analog technique with a degree of skepticism. Pettersen's philosophy was grounded in the fundamental laws of physics governing atmospheric processes, pressure gradients, Coriolis effect, thermal dynamics. Crick, however, was less interested in explaining why weather happened and more interested in what it would do next. Regardless of the underlying mechanisms, he saw weather as a series of repeating patterns, like a complex musical score with recurring motifs. His radical idea was that if one could find a historical weather map identical or nearly identical to the current one, the subsequent weather pattern from that historical event would likely repeat. The team embarked on a monumental task, compiling and digitizing as much as possible decades of historical weather charts from across the Northern Hemisphere. They searched for analogues, past weather situations that closely resembled the present. Crick envisioned a vast library of atmospheric histories, a meteorological oracle that could reveal the future by looking into the past. This was a painstaking process, relying on manual comparison of thousands of charts, seeking similar isobaric configurations, frontal passages, and pressure systems. When a strong match was found, the team would then consult the subsequent weather observations from that historical date to forecast the next 24 to 72 hours. British meteorologists, steeped in the rigorous physics of synoptic forecasting, viewed this approach with thinly veiled disdain. They considered it cherry-picking data, an unscientific attempt to force the present into convenient historical molds. Each weather event, they argued, was a unique interplay of countless variables, impossible to precisely replicate. The urgency for a more accurate forecasting method was not abstract. The memory of the Dieppe raid in August 1942 haunted Allied planners. In that ill-fated cross-channel assault, a combination of poor intelligence and rapidly deteriorating weather had contributed to a catastrophic loss of life. Over 600 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The rough seas had swamped landing craft, soaked equipment, and caused widespread seasickness, debilitating the troops before they even reached the beaches. Low clouds had hampered vital air support. The failure underscored the critical role of weather intelligence in amphibious operations. If the weather went wrong for D-Day, the cost would not be merely thousands, but potentially tens of thousands of lives, and the very liberation of Europe would be jeopardized. The pressure on Crick's team to get D-Day weather right, to find a pattern that could predict the volatile English Channel, was immense. They were not just developing a new scientific method, they were forging a weapon in the silent, invisible war against the elements. Crick believed that the sheer volume of historical data, when properly categorized, could reveal statistical probabilities that conventional methods overlooked. He argued that while no two weather systems were identical in every minute detail, major atmospheric patterns, especially those influencing broad regions like the North Atlantic, did indeed repeat themselves with variations. His team meticulously built their archives, analyzing pressure systems, frontal movements, and storm tracks from historical records spanning back to the early 20th century. They developed complex indexing systems to cross-reference current conditions with past ones, searching for the closest analog, not just for a single day, but for a sequence of days leading up to the present. This was cutting-edge work for the time, a precursor to modern statistical and ensemble forecasting. But in 1943 it was highly speculative, requiring a leap of faith that many seasoned meteorologists, particularly the more conservative British, were unwilling to make. The risks of being wrong were simply too high. Yet, Crick persisted, driven by a conviction that there were hidden rules in the atmosphere waiting to be discovered, and that D-Day, the largest gamble in military history, might just depend on them. He was preparing to bet the lives of hundreds of thousands on a statistical hunch. Returning to the tense days of early June 1944, the meteorological conflict reached its zenith. On June 3rd, the weather maps were unequivocal. A powerful low-pressure system was sweeping across the North Atlantic, promising severe gales and churning seas for the next several days. Group Captain James Stagg, heading the British meteorological team at SHAEF, presented his forecast with a grim certainty. Based on established synoptic principles, his team predicted a continuation of force 6 winds and waves reaching 6 to 8 feet in the English Channel for June 5th, the originally planned D-Day. This would persist, he warned, through June 6th and likely into the 7th. Landing craft would be swamped, paratroopers scattered, and aerial bombardments grounded. Stagg, meticulous and risk-averse, advised postponement. His data was clear, and his judgment was conservative, backed by decades of meteorological science. However, Lieutenant Commander Crick and his U.S. Army Air Force's weather unit offered a starkly contrasting prognosis. Their controversial analog method, painstakingly developed over the past year, pointed to a different outcome. Crick's team had identified a similar historical weather pattern that suggested a brief, but critical, window of amelioration. They forecast that while the main storm would indeed rage, there would be a temporary abatement, a 36-hour lull of marginally acceptable conditions starting in the early hours of June 6th. Their prediction called for winds to drop to force 4 and waves to subside to 3 to 4 feet, still challenging, but within the operational limits for the landing craft. Crucially, they also predicted a temporary lifting of the cloud ceiling to approximately 3,000 feet, vital for air support. General Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself in an agonizing dilemma. Postponing the invasion was not a simple matter of waiting a day or two. The complex tidal and lunar requirements for the invasion meant that the next suitable window wouldn't appear for at least 2 weeks. Such a delay carried immense risks. German intelligence could uncover the invasion plans, the element of surprise would be lost, and the morale of the 156,000 men poised for battle would plummet. Furthermore, keeping such a massive force, including 5 Irresolute ships and thousands of aircraft, on standby for an extended period was logistically nightmarish and would reveal the Allied intentions. The clock was ticking and the decision had to be made soon. The crucial weather briefing on the evening of June 3rd at Southwick House, Eisenhower's advanced headquarters, was a theater of scientific and strategic tension. Stagg, with his charts and satellite data, or rather, the limited data available from sparse Atlantic stations, presented a picture of unrelenting foul weather. He spoke of deep low-pressure cells, active fronts, and persistent cyclonic activity. His warnings were stark, painting a vivid picture of disaster if the invasion proceeded on June 5th. He was backed by his Royal Navy and Met Office colleagues, whose independent analyses largely concurred. Then came Crick, his voice calm but firm, presenting his analog findings. He acknowledged the overall stormy pattern, but argued for the existence of a brief back door through the storm. He showed his historical comparisons, highlighting instances where similar atmospheric setups had, against all immediate appearances, yielded a temporary clearing. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, their faces etched with anxiety. Naval commanders in particular voiced their concerns. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commander of the Allied Naval Expeditionary Force, reiterated that landing craft could not operate effectively in waves exceeding 4 feet. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, stressed the absolute necessity of a clear sky for bombing and fighter support. Without these conditions, the invasion would be a bloodbath. Eisenhower listened intently, weighing the scientific arguments against the strategic imperatives. He pressed each meteorologist, seeking not just predictions, but levels of certainty. The conflicting data from multiple named officers, all highly competent in their fields, presented him with an almost impossible choice. Stagg's caution was compelling, rooted in established science. Crick's optimism, while alluring, felt like a leap into the unknown, a gamble on a technique that many still regarded as unproven, bordering on reckless. The fate of the largest amphibious assault in history hung in the balance, dependent on which scientific philosophy Eisenhower would trust. The evening of June 4th brought the moment of truth. Inside the austere, sandbagged map room at Southwick House, a stately manor near Portsmouth, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced his corps commanders and his 3 meteorological teams. The air was heavy with the weight of consequence. The original D-Day, June 5th, was now impossible due to the unyielding storm. The question was whether to proceed on the 6th or postpone for weeks. Group Captain James Stagg, the British chief meteorologist, delivered his updated forecast first, his voice unwavering. He predicted force 6 winds continuing through June 6th, with wave heights reaching a perilous 6 feet or more in the channel. His models showed the low-pressure system lingering, offering no significant respite. To proceed, he warned, would be to invite catastrophe. His forecast was corroborated by the Royal Navy's meteorologists. The consensus among the British teams was clear. The weather was too severe. Then Lieutenant Commander Irving Crick stepped forward. His demeanor was a stark contrast to Stagg's cautious realism. Crick exuded a calm, almost evangelical confidence in his analog method. He presented his team's analysis, pointing to a historical parallel that suggested a narrow window. Their forecast called for a dramatic drop in wind speeds from the current 25-30 knots to a more manageable 12-15 knots, force 4, and a reduction in wave heights from 6 feet to 3 to 4 feet by dawn on June 6th. Crucially, they also predicted a temporary clearing of the cloud base to 3 Zozeran feet, sufficient for aerial operations. It was a bold, almost audacious, prediction that flew directly in the face of conventional meteorological wisdom. The tension in the room was palpable. Eisenhower, a man known for his decisive leadership, listened intently, his gaze moving between the meteorologists and his senior officers. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding the naval forces, articulated the severe limitations of operating in high seas. "Gentlemen," he stated, "landing craft simply cannot handle waves consistently above 4 feet. Our men will be seasick, equipment will be lost, and the beach assaults will fail before they even begin." Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory emphasized the critical need for clear skies for the planned 11 Iwa-Zuero air sorties. Without air cover, the troops would be vulnerable to German counterattacks. The psychological profiles of the two main forecasters were evident. Stagg, the methodical scientist, prioritizing safety and certainty. Crick, the innovative academic, pushing the boundaries of prediction, confident in his unconventional approach. Eisenhower turned to his generals, General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, and General Sir Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, offered their perspectives, weighing the strategic imperative of surprise against the tactical risks of poor weather. The prospect of further postponement, meaning a delay of at least 2 weeks until the next suitable tide and moon phase, was daunting. Such a delay would inevitably lead to increased German defenses, a potential leak of the invasion date, and a catastrophic dip in troop morale. The element of surprise, painstakingly cultivated for months, would be squandered. After a moment of profound silence, Eisenhower made his decision. He had listened to the arguments, absorbed the risks, and weighed the conflicting scientific counsel. The German forces, lacking precise weather data from the mid-Atlantic and relying on their own, often less accurate, meteorological predictions, would likely conclude that no invasion was possible in such conditions. This offered a tactical advantage if Crick was correct. Eisenhower looked at Crick, then back at his senior staff. "The invasion will proceed on June 6th, he announced, his voice firm, cutting through the silence like a knife. He was betting on Crick's controversial forecast, on the lie that a brief window of opportunity existed. The enormity of his decision hung in the air, a mixture of relief and trepidation washing over the room. The fleet, already partially underway, would be committed. There would be no turning back. As the first waves of landing craft churned through the grey, choppy waters of the English Channel on the evening of June 5th, the decision weighed heavily on every soul aboard. General Eisenhower's gamble seemed, at least initially, to be failing. The weather was precisely as Group Captain Stagg had predicted, fierce, unyielding, and brutal. Winds howled, whipping the sea into a maelstrom of white-capped swells. Waves crashing against the bows of the thousands of vessels frequently exceeded 6 feet, sending spray high over the decks and drenching the shivering, anxious soldiers huddled below. Aboard the troop transports and the smaller landing craft, the scene was one of utter misery and genuine fear. Soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the claustrophobic confines of the LCIs, landing craft infantry, and LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, succumbed almost immediately to violent seasickness. Vomit mixed with seawater on the decks, creating a sickening stench. Equipment, lashed down with ropes that strained and groaned under the relentless assault, threatened to break loose. Tanks and artillery pieces, stowed in the holds of LST's landing ship tank, shifted precariously with every lurch of the ships. The genuine fear that Lieutenant Commander Crick and his team had gotten it catastrophically wrong spread like contagion. Many believed they were sailing into a suicide mission, victims of a meteorological miscalculation. From the bridge of the USS Augusta, Admiral Kirk, commander of the Western Naval Task Force, watched the churning sea with growing concern. The massive cruiser, along with the battleship USS Texas and the British cruiser HMS Belfast, was more stable. But even these giants pitched and rolled heavily. Kirk's log entries recorded the severe conditions, noting the struggle of smaller vessels to maintain formation. On the smaller landing craft, sailors battled constantly to keep their vessels on course, the pounding waves threatening to capsize them. The roar of the wind and waves drowned out all other sounds, making communication difficult and adding to the sense of isolation and dread. Back in the command centers, the American weather officers monitored the conditions hourly, their faces etched with anxiety, watching for the predicted break. Each passing hour of relentless storm tightened the knot of dread in Crick's stomach. Had his analog method failed? Was his confidence a fatal hubris? The nightmare scenario of recalling 5,000 ships, an unparalleled logistical and tactical disaster, loomed large. A recall would mean turning around hundreds of thousands of men, forcing them to endure the storm again on the return journey, shattering morale, and almost certainly revealing the invasion to the Germans. The consequences would be devastating. Individual sailors and soldiers bore the brunt of the weather's fury. Private John R. Johnson, a young infantryman aboard an LCI, recalled, "The boat was bucking like a wild bronco. Guys were throwing up everywhere. You couldn't tell if it was tears or seawater on their faces. We all thought, this is it. We're going to drown before we even see a German." Petty Officer Second Class Michael O'Reilly, a coxswain of an LCVP, fought the waves with grim determination. Every single wave felt like it was going to tear the bow off. We had to keep the engines at full throttle just to maintain some semblance of direction. I prayed for dawn for any sign of a break. The hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. The conditions were truly awful, a testament to the raw power of the North Atlantic. Doubt gnawed at the edges of even the most hardened commanders. The forecast, the bold, controversial forecast, seemed to have been a terrible mistake, but Crick held firm, clinging to the statistical patterns that had, so often in the past, revealed a hidden truth within the chaos. The waiting was excruciating, a silent battle against despair as the fleet plunged deeper into the storm, trusting in a prediction that defied all sensory evidence. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, as if by some miraculous intervention, the weather broke. Precisely as Lieutenant Commander Crick's analog forecast had predicted, the ferocious storm that had battered the Allied fleet for hours began to abate. At approximately 0200 hours, a collective, almost audible sigh of relief swept across the channel. The howling winds, which had ripped through the fleet at 25-30 knots, suddenly dropped to a more manageable 12 to 15 knots, a force 4 breeze that was still brisk but no longer life-threatening. The towering 6-foot waves, which had threatened to swamp every landing craft, decreased to a tolerable 3 to 4 feet, allowing the smaller vessels to ride the swells rather than battle them. Simultaneously, the oppressive, low-lying cloud ceiling that had hugged the water all night began to lift, gradually clearing to approximately 3,000 feet, opening a vital pathway for the thousands of Allied aircraft waiting to unleash their devastating power. This sudden, dramatic shift in conditions was more than just a lucky break. It was a testament to the predictive power of Crick's unconventional methodology. The lie had become truth. The storm had indeed been immense, but within its fury, there was a fleeting, critical window that conventional meteorology had missed. This meteorological deception, however, extended beyond the Allies. The Germans, relying on their own meteorological services, which were severely hampered by a lack of Atlantic weather stations, and relying on traditional synoptic forecasting, had predicted that the severe storm would continue for several more days. Their meteorologists, viewing the same initial data as Group Captain Stagg, concluded that no invasion was feasible in such conditions. This grave miscalculation led to a crucial strategic blunder. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary German commander responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, was so confident that the foul weather precluded an invasion that he had taken leave to visit his wife Lucy for her birthday in Germany on June 5th. Many other senior German officers were away from their posts, attending war games or on leave. Coastal defenses, though formidable, were undermanned and lacked the full alert status that would have met the Allies head-on. The element of surprise, painstakingly achieved through elaborate deception plans and now unexpectedly augmented by the weather, was complete. The German High Command, believing the storm provided an impenetrable shield, was caught entirely off guard. At 5:50 hours, the immense naval bombardment began. 7 battleships, including the USS Texas and HMS Warspite, along with 18 cruisers and 43 destroyers, unleashed a thunderous barrage upon the German defenses. Shells screamed overhead, striking fortifications, artillery positions, and machine gun nests along the Normandy beaches. The roar was deafening, the flashes illuminating the breaking dawn with terrifying brilliance. The precision of the naval gunfire, guided by spotting aircraft now able to operate in the higher cloud ceiling, was crucial in suppressing enemy fire before the first waves of infantry hit the beaches. As the landing craft lowered their ramps and thousands of young men stormed onto the shores of Normandy, they were met not with an unbreachable storm, but with a battlefield made marginally more survivable by a weather forecast that had challenged all norms. The rough seas had caused immense hardship and seasickness, debilitating many troops, but they were still able to land. The air support was there. The naval guns were firing, and most crucially, the Germans were not fully prepared. The lie about the weather, Crick's bold and controversial prediction, had purchased the Allies invaluable hours, ensuring that the initial assault, though brutal, had a fighting chance. It was a victory not just of arms, but of intellect and unconventional thinking, turning the very elements into an unexpected ally. The success of the D-Day invasion, at least in its initial critical hours, was inextricably linked to that narrow weather window. The lie about the storm, or rather, the truth hidden within it, had brought the Allies the element of surprise and the operational conditions necessary to gain a foothold in Normandy. On June 6, 1944, a staggering 156 Zero Allied troops were successfully landed on the beaches of France. This colossal undertaking involved over 4 Zero landing craft of various types, supported by a massive armada of 600 warships, providing naval gunfire, anti-aircraft defense, and logistical support. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented, and its initial success, particularly the ability to land heavy equipment and maintain air superiority, was profoundly influenced by the weather. While the battle for Normandy was far from over and casualties were tragically high, the actual numbers were significantly lower than what had been projected for an invasion under adverse weather. Initial estimates for D-Day casualties, particularly if the weather had been truly unfavorable, ranged as high as 50, to 100 for the first wave alone. The actual Allied casualties on D-Day stood at approximately 10, killed, wounded, or missing, a devastating figure, but dramatically less than the projected worst-case scenarios. The brief respite in the weather, predicted by Crick's team, directly contributed to this outcome. In the aftermath, even the British meteorologists, initially skeptical, had to grudgingly acknowledge that the American technique had, against all odds, worked. Group Captain James Stagg, though still a proponent of the synoptic method, later admitted the crucial role the American forecast played. The specific advantages the weather window provided were manifold. Air superiority was paramount. A staggering 11 Zero sorties were flown on D-Day, providing critical close air support, reconnaissance and bombing of German positions. This was only possible because the cloud ceiling lifted as predicted. Naval gunfire accuracy was dramatically improved, as spotting planes could operate effectively, allowing battleships and cruisers to suppress enemy strongholds with precision. Most importantly, the reduction in wave heights allowed for the successful landing of tanks, artillery, and other heavy equipment, which would have been impossible in rougher seas. These assets were vital for breaking out of the beachheads. Intercepted German communications quickly confirmed their complete surprise. Field Marshal Rommel, returning from Germany, was shocked to learn of the invasion. Reports from German coastal units indicated chaos and disbelief, with many initially thinking it was a large-scale deception or reconnaissance mission. Their own meteorological predictions had lulled them into a false sense of security, convincing them that the storm made an invasion impossible. This meteorological asymmetry became a decisive factor. For Crick and his team, the vindication was profound. Their controversial method, once scoffed at as cherry-picking or unscientific, had delivered when it mattered most. The pressure they had faced, the skepticism, and the immense risk associated with their forecast all melted away in the face of the invasion's initial success. They had not merely predicted the weather, they had, in a sense, manipulated the strategic landscape by seeing a truth that others could not. Their bold claim of a brief clearing, a statistical anomaly, had allowed Eisenhower to make the most consequential military decision of the 20th century with a confidence that would have been impossible had he relied solely on traditional methods. D-Day was a triumph of planning, courage, and logistics, but without the precise timing provided by Crick's team, it might never have become the turning point of World War II. The deeper truth behind the lying about the weather wasn't a deliberate fabrication, but a profound insight into atmospheric predictability that defied the conventional wisdom of the time. Lieutenant Commander Crick's team had not truly lied. Instead, they had looked beyond the immediate chaotic data to find a hidden pattern, a statistical probability that allowed them to predict a brief window of calm within a larger, more formidable storm. Their analog technique, initially viewed with suspicion, was a revolutionary approach rooted in exhaustive historical analysis. Crick's team had meticulously analyzed over 50 years of North Atlantic weather patterns, compiling an unprecedented archive of historical charts and observations. Through this laborious process, they identified approximately 30 historical situations that were nearly identical to the synoptic conditions observed in early June 1944. What they discovered was a recurring anomaly. In 28 of those 30 analogous cases, a brief yet distinct clearing period occurred approximately 36 to 48 hours after the initial passage of a strong storm front. This statistical tendency, this recurring atmospheric signature, was the key to their forecast. The lie was, in essence, trusting this pattern recognition over the real-time, immediate data that showed only continuous storm. It was a leap of faith, a bet on historical precedent overriding present-day evidence, a concept that became the foundational cornerstone of modern ensemble forecasting and statistical meteorology. They understood that while the physics of each storm were unique, the large-scale atmospheric dynamics often repeated themselves in predictable ways. The post-war impact of this bold methodology was immense. While Crick's analog technique wasn't immediately adopted universally, it laid the groundwork for significant advancements in meteorology. The concept of comparing current atmospheric states to past ones to derive probabilities became a standard practice, evolving from manual chart comparisons to sophisticated computer models. Irving Crick himself went on to become a renowned figure in post-war meteorology, founding successful private weather forecasting companies that applied similar principles to everything from agriculture to film production. His work influenced the development of advanced statistical models and eventually the numerical weather prediction systems that now underpin virtually all modern forecasting. D-Day's success was undoubtedly a monumental achievement, a complex tapestry woven from countless threads of strategy, logistics, and courage. But the weather timing, orchestrated by Crick's controversial forecast, was an absolutely crucial thread. A 24-hour delay in the invasion, as initially considered, would have pushed the assault past the optimal tide and moon phase, necessitating a week-long postponement. This delay would have granted the Germans invaluable time to reinforce their defenses, move additional panzer divisions to the coast, and potentially uncover the invasion's precise location. The cost in Allied lives would have been immeasurable and the outcome of the war potentially altered. The story of Crick and his team is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important intelligence, the most decisive advantage, comes from challenging conventional wisdom, from looking beyond the obvious, and from trusting an unconventional perspective. In the face of overwhelming odds and scientific skepticism, they dared to see a truth that others couldn't. A brief window of opportunity in a raging storm. Their courage to lie to the weather, to place their faith in a statistical whisper amidst a meteorological roar, not only saved thousands of lives but fundamentally altered the course of World War II, proving that innovation, even in the most unexpected fields, can win battles and change history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.